Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1131 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. Don't mind me, I'm just sitting over here thankful that we have another chapter of One Piece. Let's freaking go. This is pretty much your quintessential setup chapter in One Piece. Is anything happening here that's like gonna break the internet? No, I don't think so. But we're also at the very beginning of the arc. Like, I felt like the break was actually perfectly timed just because Oda left us with something insanely hyped, the reveal of Loki, and gave us a few weeks to mull it over. But it's like easy to forget, we're still at the beginning, so we're still in the setup phase of the arc itself. And right now, what's most important is introducing the characters that are relevant, that matter for this story, and setting up the plot. So I guess if you're going to review this chapter, this is probably the best place to start, which is that we have a much clearer picture of who Loki is. And I was actually really excited about this because Loki, as revealed in this chapter, seems very similar to Loki as most people would understand him from Norse mythology or pop culture. This dude is devious. But just to give credit where credit is due, Oda does this all the time. We take it for granted all the time, and then I end up mentioning it in every chapter that we take for granted all of the time. But Oda is a master of introducing and establishing characters. He does it so concisely, and it is so much harder than people realize. But anyway, in a span of about half of a chapter, you learn that Loki is full of himself. He is egotistical. Luffy over here hyped about being in Elbaf, just talking his head off, and Loki is getting mad that his voice is not heard. But this aspect of Loki makes a ton of sense. It makes a ton of sense because of the Loki that we know from pop culture, because that dude is a petulant brat. But it also makes a ton of sense because of Loki, as is his circumstances in the story of One Piece. He's a prince. And almost like a Big Mom way, you get the impression that this dude was pretty strong from the moment that he's born. He's special in various ways, and he knows it. It just seems like calling him a spoiled brat would be an accurate assessment at this moment. But here's where it gets really cool to me. There's a lot of spoiled brats in the story of One Piece. You have the celestial dragons like Sharlos, you have bosses like Wapol from earlier in the story, even Big Mom, who we've already talked about. And in almost every case, these spoiled brats are imbeciles. They're morons. And this to me is what makes Loki different, because in the following panels, you learn that he's manipulative. He's trying to coerce Luffy to do what he wants him to do. And to be good at it, you have to be smart. And we literally see that play out. It's almost like a game, right? Loki's playing a game where he's trying to find an opening and an advantage to exploit Luffy. He begins with, look, I'm Loki, strongest person of Elbaf, strongest person in the world. If you want one pirate crew out there destroyed, I'll do it for you if you do what I ask. That obviously won't work on Luffy. But then through the conversation, Shanks comes up, Luffy gets excited about Shanks, wants to know things about Shanks, and he flips. The transition from plan A to plan B was incredibly smooth. Oh, I do know something about Shanks, but I'm not gonna tell you for free. Like I said, guys, Loki is seeming like an intelligent character. I guess this is the kind of shit that really hypes up longtime fans like me, who has spent way too much time reading One Piece, is like just like the realization, everyone eventually has it, of there are so many characters in One Piece. It is absurd how many characters there are in One Piece. And for Oda to make them different, 25, 30 years after planning this out, beginning writing this story, is such an amazing feat. But I can confidently and honestly tell you that I feel like Loki is different. He's different from any other boss character that we've ever met. And what this slight difference leads to is possibility. Exciting possibility for the potential of this arc, as a different experience to anything else that we've had. In my opinion, this has to be intentional, but Loki and Luffy complement or foil themselves in a really important way. Like, one of the defining characteristics of Luffy throughout the story that Oda makes sure to highlight is that Luffy is easily tricked. And in Elbaf, he's going against a trickster who is probably actually good at it. It just feels perfect for this moment in time, because I think another way to define this chapter, I guess, like, look at how you felt about Loki two weeks ago. The premise of that, I think the feeling that most everybody had or were left with at the end of that chapter is that Loki is a force. Loki hype was through the roof. But the feeling that you're left with in this chapter is that a reminder that Luffy is a force. He is a Yonko now. There's very little that could surprise him. He has already been to hell and back, so being in Elbaf's version of hell doesn't shake him in the slightest. In fact, Loki seems more shocked about Luffy than Luffy seems shocked about Loki, and all of that really makes a ton of sense because, the impression that I have, I think it's a fair speculation, Loki has never left Elbaf, right? So straight up, Luffy has more experience than him. He's been on a whole ass adventure. Even if Loki is technically way older than Luffy, he kind of comes off as a rookie. But I guess the point of what I'm saying here is that the impression that this chapter leaves you, which is different from the last one, is it doesn't appear as if Loki is an insurmountable foe to Luffy. Oda does not want us to think that Loki is stronger than Luffy. So again, perusing through the thousands of pages of One Piece and all of the various arcs, this is not usually the case. And it's not typically a thing that works. The standard setup in all of shonen fighting manga is that your hero fights an enemy who is vastly stronger than him, and he has to use willpower, timely power-ups in order to overcome the odds. But are we over here saying that Loki is no longer hype anymore? I don't think anybody's saying that. And this is because of nuanced applications of power scaling. Loki being a trickster, Luffy being easily tricked, potentially evens the odds, and provides Luffy with a formidable challenge, without every arc being the new introduction of Kaido. But of course, as always, I don't speak for everybody, so I am curious as to what you think. And the reality is that if, the comparison here that I would make for how I feel like Loki is going to play out in this arc, comparing it to other villains in the story of One Piece, and those arcs perhaps are not the arcs that everyone loves most. You can think about Punk Hazard, or you could think about the Foxy arc. Personally, I loved the Foxy arc, mainly because it was hilarious, but Foxy never stood a chance against Luffy. The only reason that he did is because he was a trickster, and he cheated. Likewise, in Punk Hazard, Caesar never really stood a chance against Luffy, but through the power of science, he evened the odds. But to expand upon this more, right, if you look at Caesar or you look at Foxy, the similarity between the two characters is that they were both kind of a joke. I really doubt that that will be true for Loki. He's legitimately strong, even if he isn't as strong as Luffy, he's legitimately strong, and he's crazy powerful and intimidating. This is also just another way in which Oda has fiddled with his various characters to create something that I think will be a new experience. Honestly, you should really be comparing Loki to Akainu. Think about Akainu in the Marineford arc. You don't think less of him because he manipulated Squardo to stab Whitebeard. You think of him as competent. Even if it might also be true that had Akainu not done that, then Whitebeard would have beat him, which he kind of did anyway, even with half of a face. But if you can't tell, I'm hyped about this. I think that this is interesting. This is a unique dynamic that I'm glad that we get to explore, because most likely, after we leave Elbaf, it will go back to the Kaido formula, like Emu, Blackbeard with multiple Devil Fruits, Awakening, all of that stuff. They will probably just be stronger than Luffy, and we'll go back to needing guts and a timely power-up. But just to make sure that we say this, it's still absolutely possible for Loki to be as strong or stronger than Luffy. It's just my read about the chapter right now. This is just my impression. And possibly also a little bit of bias because I am a sucker for some scheming. So just a hypothetical to throw at you as a possibility in my mind, something that we've talked about since pretty much the beginning of this arc is, the first that we ever heard of Loki is that he was getting married to Lola. And, the silhouette of Loki that we saw is nothing like the actual Loki that we've met, but in the way that it was drawn, he really seemed like he was in love with Lola. Our guy was piney. This could also be really fitting as well, because we know that the Giants of Elbaf have had an unfavorable opinion of Loki for a while, so it's possible, literally none of the girl giants in Elbaf love Loki, so he's desperate to find love. I bring this up because I think there's never really been a legitimate circumstance in a major One Piece arc where one of the Straw Hats was captured by their enemy and essentially held hostage. You could think about Robin and Enies Lobby, but they weren't going to kill Robin. They didn't even threaten it. So yeah, just thinking about it as quickly as I can, I don't think that there's ever been a comparable scenario for Luffy, the same as what Odin experienced in Wano. The impression in Wano that we got is that Odin could have defeated Orochi and could have declared war on Kaido the moment that he returned to that island, but he didn't because Orochi held the people of Wano hostage. So Loki, being the trickster as we perceive him right now, perhaps captures one of the Straw Hats, such as Robin or Nami. I'm leaning towards Nami, and then puts Luffy in a situation where he maybe can't necessarily fight his way out of it, at least not immediately. And I suppose this is a good segue into the last aspect of Loki's character that was revealed in this chapter, which is that dude is vengeful. We got a thought bubble in the middle of his conversation with Luffy where he basically promised, hey, you know, set me free and all will be well. But then the thought bubble was like, as soon as I'm free, I'm going to kill him. Based on this alone, you shouldn't think of Loki as having Kaido's honor and integrity. He's more like Orochi in Kaido's body. Hence why I think some unusual things could potentially happen with him. But yeah, I'm curious as to what you think about Loki's special bounty. That was revealed in the chapter in his introductory text boxes. He has a 2.6 billion berry bounty, but it's a special bounty. We've never seen that before. A really cool theory that I saw on Twitter from 3skull Joe is that potentially the person that Shanks warned the government about was not actually anybody who we actually thought it would be, like Blackbeard, and is instead Loki. But as a brief refresher, in case you don't remember, Shanks warned the Gorosei about somebody during the reverie, and that hasn't amounted to anything yet. Given Oda made a point of establishing some relationship between Shanks and Loki in this chapter, it's like a thought like this suddenly, it could work. And maybe that would explain the special bounty. But details aside, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around how a bounty can be special. You would just issue a bounty, would you not? And it would be just like every other bounty. Why would you need to clarify that it's special? Under what circumstances? So guys, right now, the only thought that really makes any sense to me is that this bounty was issued despite Loki having never committed a crime. We've already speculated this, that Loki has never left the island of Elbaf. We also know that people can't just visit Elbaf, that foreigners are not allowed in, and this is just not something that occurs. So if we assume all of this to be true, how is it even possible for Loki to have earned a bounty from the world government? This is how the special bounty makes sense to me. It is also incredibly dystopian that the world government has potentially issued a bounty without somebody ever having committed a crime. Like, the justification would be something like, we know he will commit a crime in the future. Wild. The other possibility, though, that I'm toying around with is that the leader of Elbaf, the king of Elbaf, just always gets a special bounty. It's like some rule. Perhaps this isn't an intuitive thought to a lot of people, but it makes sense to me. Technically speaking, right? Do you think that it's possible that Elbaf and the world government are at war, officially declared war, that has essentially never ended since the Void Century? I mean, they do call Elbaf Warland. Then if they're officially at war, to give the leader of the country of Elbaf, no matter who it is, a special bounty, that would also make sense. Perhaps special bounties are issued when dealing with kings of other countries not affiliated with the world government. Food for thought. But anyway, you guys already know, right, that this just seems like this is the case with nearly every One Piece chapter, but Oda absolutely packs it with various parallels. And I felt like there was a lot of parallels to explore, specifically between Luffy and Loki, but also with Loki and Shanks. So I guess we'll start with Shanks. The only reason Shanks even came up in this chapter is that he had visited Elbaf recently. We already knew that. Apparently Loki was aware of that. There was some interaction between Loki and Shanks and his people. But like the reason for this, and like we just gotta understand this at this point in time, is that Shanks visited Elbaf because there's probably a road poneglyph here, and he came here to collect its rubbing. That is literally the primary focus of Shanks right now, is he's going to go find the One Piece, and everything that we've seen leading up to this is him collecting the rubbings of poneglyphs, meaning it's 100%. There is a road poneglyph here, or at least something very important. But probably more interesting from this chapter is the relationship between Loki and Shanks. Loki said that Shanks was a coward. He must have a reason for doing so. He didn't know that Luffy knew Shanks or that Shanks was his idol ahead of time, so he didn't say it to intentionally manipulate Luffy. This is his legitimate opinion based on experience. I feel like the most popular theory right now is that Shanks had something to do with Loki getting tied up 6 years ago. Even before we got to Elbaf, people already had the impression, they had the thought, it was already a pretty common speculation that Elbaf was Shanks' territory, because all of the Yonko have territory. You can just look at Shanks' ship, and it just has the general vibe of something inspired from Elbaf. I think it's also cool, through process of elimination, you can figure out another connection. There was originally a road poneglyph in Fishman Island. We saw it in Gold Roger and Odin's flashback. But that road poneglyph is no longer there. Somebody moved it. So we know that there are 4 total road poneglyphs. The road poneglyph in Zoe has not moved. The road poneglyph in Wano has not moved. And we know that Roger snuck into Whole Cake Island to steal a rubbing of Big Mom's poneglyph. So that one hasn't moved either. So if we're already pretty certain that Elbaf has a road poneglyph, we know that this was the poneglyph that was originally in Fishman Island. So after Roger became the Pirate King, we need a character with motivation and ability to move the poneglyph from Fishman Island to Elbaf. Shanks is a prime candidate. I think that it's pretty obvious that Shanks is focused on the next era. He is manipulating things to create the current circumstances in the One Piece world. Somebody moving a poneglyph to hide it as part of the adventure. Really, it only makes sense for it to have been Shanks, in my opinion. So if Elbaf has been a part of Shanks' territory for the past 10 years or so, you potentially have a window of opportunity for Shanks to be involved in Loki's capture. And it just seems this way to me for now. Obviously, we will find out in the future. It just seems like they didn't legitimately fight Loki. Hence why Loki might have called Shanks a coward. But yeah, we began all of this conversation because I think that there's parallels between Shanks and Loki, or maybe Shanks and Luffy. And it's really just Loki calling Shanks a coward because it reminds me of the very beginning of the story of One Piece. The first flashback with Luffy as a kid when he ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Higuma also called Shanks a coward because he wouldn't fight. At least he wouldn't fight until his friends were in danger. I wonder if there's something similar going on with Loki's story. Shanks never fought him. Perhaps he was never a legitimate threat to Shanks' friends. But this is also interesting because of Luffy. Remember, Higuma called Shanks a coward and was like begging Shanks to fight him, but Shanks wouldn't do it, and that really upset child Luffy. Despite the adventure, it seems like Luffy's perspective has not changed, because Loki did the same thing Higuma did, and Luffy immediately fought him. I feel like I should spend a long time analyzing this or trying to understand this or finding the hidden meaning here, but I really don't know. All I can tell you is that these scenes seem related, and it's possible that Luffy still has something to learn. Shanks has made it abundantly clear that he does not care about his own reputation. He doesn't care what people say about him. It's only Luffy who cares what people say about him. Why is that? But yeah, if you want a 9,000 IQ theory, you can take an idea such as this and then apply it as perhaps a theme, eventual theme of the Elbaf arc. Something I already said is that I view Loki as being Orochi in Kaido's body, right? So I think that a low-key element of Odin's flashback in Wano with Orochi relates to pride. Orochi manipulated Odin by threatening the people of Wano. Orochi then tricked Odin to agree to a deal, which was that in a few years' time he would leave. But until then, Odin had to act like a fool. This was the meme of Odin dancing through the streets half naked, acting like a fool. They called him a fool of a lord. And as time passed and Orochi's crimes intensified and the people realized somebody needed to defeat him, they started to call Odin a coward. Do you guys see where I am going? Both Odin and his retainers had to swallow their pride. Now you can make an argument that Odin was similar to Shanks and really just did not care. His own reputation was meaningless to him, and frankly that relates all the way back to his childhood. He got disowned and flipped everybody the bird. And then when finally the entire country respects him, he left. But that is certainly not the case for his retainers. They had to learn. I also think that this heavily relates to Joy Boy. Odin dancing around, the various awkward postures that he uses reminds you of like Luffy and the crew dancing around the fire in Skypiea, which later turned out to be very similar to Kuma's dance that was supposed to be about the sun god. We've made whole theories in the past essentially speculating that Odin was a near Joy Boy or a Joy Boy candidate, and that there's a lot of characteristics about him and about his story that are probably relevant to Joy Boy. So now take this conversation and apply it to Luffy and Elbaf. We already have a pretty strong suspicion that the sun god in Joy Boy is going to be an important element of this arc. In my opinion, this is the arc in which the world begins to recognize that Luffy is the sun god. Maybe this is the time in the story where he needs to put aside his pride and act a fool. These are the kind of parallels that would make sense to me. For one reason or another in this arc, people begin to call Luffy a coward. But I gotta be straight up honest with you, I'm not entirely sure of how much this would actually affect Luffy. Luffy is incredibly instinctual, and I think that he would put aside his pride if it meant saving people, saving his friends, if he thought that that was the best way. I just don't feel like he would actually care. In my opinion, Luffy cares more about Shanks' reputation than his own. But I could be wrong about that. But I do know that there is a member of the Straw Hats who absolutely would care. That person is Zoro. Chapter 438 of One Piece is titled Pride. In that chapter, he makes it clear that he has very high standards for Luffy as a captain, and this is something that he reiterates throughout the story. Oda also often draws him frustrated when Luffy acts a fool. I think that for this to work, Zoro would have to misunderstand or not fully understand why Luffy is doing what he's doing. But that was also the case for Oden's retainers in Wano. Oden didn't explain himself, and the retainers started to get frustrated. So at the very least, I thought this was worth speculating. Another way in which this theory is potentially interesting. Pride is also an interesting character trait when analyzing Usopp. To me, it would seem totally reasonable for pride to be an important component of Elbaf. But anyway, there's also parallels to explore between Loki and Luffy. As I've already explained, I think that Oden was a near Joy Boy or a Joy Boy candidate. There's elements of Joy Boy's story hidden within Oden's. And the big theory that we made about this is that this is true of many characters. There are many Joy Boy candidates that didn't become Joy Boy, but contain aspects of him. This includes some obvious characters like Roger, some less obvious characters like Dr. Hiruluk, and even enemies such as Kaido. But yeah, given that Loki claims to be the sun god, I think that it's pretty intuitive to think that he has some reason for believing this. I think that most people understand that there are prophecies about Joy Boy that are scattered across the land, that are repeated in rumor and in legend. So there are several people around the world that have an idea of what Joy Boy should be and what Joy Boy might do. And for these legends to exist on the island of Elbaf would make more sense than anything. It's one of the few islands that remains untouched by the world's government. They couldn't erase the true history. So as Loki claims to be the sun god, I think that it's actually based off of prophecies that actually exist, and probably he demonstrates some characteristics which make him think, yeah, I'm that guy. But we, the readers, know that he is in fact not that guy. Luffy is that guy. But if Loki has some characteristics or some similarities or could see himself as being the person of prophecy, then you're gonna find similarities between Luffy and Loki. And we saw one of them in this chapter. In his childhood, Loki tamed the great animals of the mountains. Luffy shows up and Oda reminds us this is also a characteristic of Luffy. I would heavily wager that once we get these prophecies in full, it probably says that this is a sign of Joy Boy, or a sign of the sun god. We mentioned this just a second ago, and I made a whole video about this, but I believe that Kaido is a Joy Boy candidate, or was. He was also known as the world's strongest creature with a crew full of creatures. But when we're talking about near Joy Boys, no matter which character it is, aside from Luffy, there's always just some element of that Oda has manipulated. Roger, what if Joy Boy came too soon? Noland, what if Joy Boy was not a pirate? Dr. Hiruluk, what if Joy Boy was not strong? Odin, what if Joy Boy did not want to be the captain? Or Kaido, what if Joy Boy felt no joy? What if instead of freeing people, he instead conquered them? You could even make speculations about Shanks. What if Joy Boy didn't believe in himself? Anyway, I'm sure that there's a more polished way of communicating this, but I hope that I conveyed the idea. So if Loki is a near Joy Boy or a Joy Boy candidate, right, you should think about his story in a similar way. There will be some kind of clever inversion here or there, or everywhere. What if Joy Boy was a liar sort of thing? And while we're here, Loki being a liar could also be really important thematically to the arc. I'm sure the moment that I say Loki is a liar, your first thought is probably Usopp, who we think will be important in Elbaf. In my opinion, it is not a coincidence that when we're first dropped in the island of Elbaf, everything that we see and experience is a lie. So with that being said, be very, very careful of any assumptions that you make about Loki, because they might not be true. And just to spell it out for you, I'm very open-minded at this moment about whether or not Loki is actually evil. Going back to something that we speculated earlier is Loki calls Shanks a coward. Speculate that Shanks decided not to fight Loki. Going back to the original chapters of One Piece and Higuma and Shanks, Shanks didn't fight Higuma until he was a threat to his friends. Maybe Loki was never a threat. Maybe Shanks understood that Loki is a liar. Just some more food for thought. I understand that we're in tinfoil land, okay? This is my normal state of being. But I suppose the takeaway of all this is just be aware of potential parallels or similarities between Loki and Luffy. If Loki claims to be the sun god, he probably has a reason for doing so. So anything that we learn about him or about his story could end up being clues about Joy Boy. I think that it's also worth bearing in mind where Loki and Luffy are opposite, or foils. I suppose one last hypothetical to throw at you is one of the takeaways of this chapter. I felt like was that Luffy came off as just a lot more experienced than Loki did. And the way that I've made this make sense is that Loki hasn't adventured the world, right? He hasn't left Elbaf. So you could also potentially think of him as a Joy Boy candidate who has not yet begun his adventure. But the interesting thing about this is that Loki is actually far older than Luffy is, technically speaking. Even if he's still relatively young in giant years, he's something like 20. So the giants explain to us that they believe that if Loki were to escape his chains, then the world would be destroyed. As a side note, this also justifies Loki as a Joy Boy candidate. We already pretty much know that Luffy is going to destroy the world, or he's, in the terms of Sengoku and Whitebeard and Marineford, he's going to turn the world upside down. But I think from this, a fair question to ask is, why hasn't Loki already left Elbaf if he hasn't? It's pretty clear that he was king of Elbaf for some time and had the freedom to leave like Odin, but it does not appear as if that happened. So a thought that has occurred to me regarding Loki is, what if Joy Boy was a coward? He called Shanks a coward in this chapter. I think that we call this phenomenon projecting. It's just a thought that has occurred to me. Would also be insanely cool considering Usopp. But yeah, I suppose we're 25 minutes into the review and we haven't addressed the elephant in the room. Aside from all the details about Loki's character and all the various ways that we can overanalyze it, the big question that we're left with from the chapter is Luffy going to free him or not? My gut says yes. It just feels like something Luffy would do. And this could also end up being an interesting element of Elbaf if the giants essentially blame Luffy for freeing the monster. But yeah, before we move on from the Loki part of this chapter, just some random thoughts that I had. First off, Loki calls this area of Wano Hell, the land of the dead. And you can see a lot of similarities between this land and the frozen level of Impel Down. If you guys remember from the frozen level of Impel Down, beyond it just being freezing just like this, there was also murderous wolves. I also thought that this bit of dialogue was interesting. Loki says, if you dig up the snow around here, you'll find the bones of countless humans and giants. These things have lived on this mountain for thousands of years. In our legends, they call this the First World. This seemingly confirms that this tree is thousands plural years old, meaning it predates the flooding during the Void Century. So I think that is pretty obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. The frozen layer of Impel Down is probably literally based off of this place in Elbaf. I believe that it is likely when Impel Down was originally created, it was not underwater. But this phrasing of calling this place the First World has my ears perked up, because there is likely layers of the tree that we do not see because they are now flooded. Meaning in the past there was possibly other layers of hell at the bottom levels of the tree. For instance, the boiling hell. Guys, I guess what I'm saying is that there's possibly a comparison to be made between Impel Down and literally the entire tree of Elbaf, Treasure Tree Adam. You can think about the tree as being similar to the hole Luffy traveled down in Impel Down, inversed. At the very least, this is fun to think about because we know that there were 6 levels of Impel Down, 7 if you include New Kama Land. This means that we could speculate that there was at one point in time 6 levels of this tree, and only 2 of them remain. Where we are currently, which is similar to the Freezing Hell or level 5, and the very top of the tree, which might be similar to level 6 or the Eternal Hell, the level that supposedly doesn't exist. But yeah, calling this the First World is also interesting because the tree is named in this chapter, and I still think that they also call it Yggdrasil, but the name given in this chapter is Treasure Tree Adam. Adam the first man. Straight up, I think that this is the first island ever in the story of One Piece. This is where life began, or this is where humans first came from, something like that. We've spent some time over the past year analyzing the story of One Piece biblically, making comparisons between Luffy and figures from the Bible. Treasure Tree Adam, right? And Adam is one of those examples. But the interesting thing here is that Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they were cast from heaven. Maybe this is supposed to be where Adam and Eve were cast to. Treasure Tree Adam and Sunlight Eve. So then paralleling this tree with Impel Down or with Hell might take on additional meaning. You can also potentially think of these 2 trees, Sunlight Eve and Treasure Tree Adam, as the Garden of Eden, and humans were cast from them, and literally the rest of the world is hell. This place is literally the land of the sun god, the land of God. But I'll just leave this for you to ponder on as you see fit. And finally, the last random thought that I have is that there seems to be a parallel between the animals that Loki has made his subordinate, has tamed, and the mountain gods. Right, in Wano they refer to the great white boar as a mountain god, and literally these great animals seem to be living within the mountains of Elbaf. These would appear to be your OG mountain gods, where that term came from. So I'm just imagining in my mind that sometime in the past, somebody visited Elbaf, took a white boar which was originally from Elbaf and snuck it away and brought it to Wano. Or brought two of them so that they could procreate. So the mountain boar is no longer native to Elbaf, it's now native to Wano. But Elbaf was its original home. But this thought could also be potentially mind-blowing. Guys, I want to remind you that the world has flooded. The vast majority of the islands which exist today were originally the tops of mountains. In the past, did all of these mountains have gods? So the mountain god that we see in Wano is actually a relic of the past, and originally all of these islands, all of these mountains got mountain gods, many of which are now dead. So anyway, coincidence or not, you decide, but it is also intriguing. You'll notice that much of the royalty from the various islands are also named after animals, as well as random characters here or there. Doflamingo, Boa Hancock, Hawkeye's Mihawk, Crocodile, Monkey D, Nefertari Cobra, Kuma. But anyway, I think that you get it. There's also some potential foreshadowing or something related here with the Torino Kingdom, which was the kingdom that Chopper visited during the time skip. Torino Kingdom was also known as a treasure island that was dominated by a giant tree, perhaps similar to Elbaf, dominated by a giant tree called Treasure Tree Adam. This island is ruled by giant birds, perhaps their version of mountain gods. It's also fitting because the residents of Torino Kingdom seemed really primitive, kind of like the giants of Elbaf. But I suppose I didn't spell this out clearly enough. All the characters named after animals, I just wonder if it's a very subtle clue that these characters are all descendant from royalty of the past. Their names relate to the mountain gods from the islands that they once came from. A shot in the dark, but you guys know it do be like that. But anyway, let's transition to the end of the chapter, which focused on the Straw Hats that are not Luffy. So the rest of the Straw Hats on Elbaf are still trying to cross the bridge, but crossing it is no easy feat because, first off, it is a bridge made for giants, and it is incredibly long for a giant, and at the same time, you have like crazy blizzard conditions, the bridge is wobbling. This is not a good time. Now, while all of this is occurring, you can see Road flee from the castle, presumably because the other giants confronted him, realized what was going on, maybe found his diorama. Poor guy's having a bad day. But of course, he's fleeing the castle, which means that he's traveling across the bridge, which the Straw Hats are traveling on. They're trying not to encounter giants because they know for a fact that they are not supposed to be there. It's really hard to imagine that they outrun a giant. So as I see it, there are two likely outcomes. One, they fall off of the bridge and end up in the forest somewhere, but separated from Luffy, which would be great. Sarcasm. Or option number two, they simply get caught. But the good thing is that even if they get caught, we're talking about members of Hyrogen's crew. Hyrogen, who has pledged loyalty to Luffy and is a member of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, right? They know that they have the Straw Hats because they're literally carrying the Straw Hat ship. Probably also the reason why they're mad at Road. So this could just be leading up to the Straw Hats finally making acquaintance with the new giant warrior pirates, which would be great. This time, not sarcasm. And all of this gets reaffirmed as we get to see Hyrogen in Elbaf itself. He's literally hunting what he calls a moose, but it looks like a dragon. But he's hunting this for the Straw Hats as a delicacy. As a side note, I think that we finally know what the antlered skull thing was that Road was wearing. And it's just a reminder that he was aware that Dory and Brogy were leaving Elbaf, going to Egghead to retrieve the Strats, so he knew, or he knows, that the Strats were coming. Honestly, while I just kind of want the Strats to meet Hyrogen and mingle and learn about this village, I do think it would be pretty interesting if they somehow escaped them, and then Hyrogen just simply believes that the Strats are missing, or that they might encounter less friendly giants. Misunderstandings are almost always a great time. The only other thing about this scene that I find to be interesting is Oda reveals some sort of unique thing in the island of Elbaf, which is roughly translated as sunstone pinders. I haven't read the official translation yet, but it probably translates it differently. But the impression I get is that they are rocks that are used to cook. I'm curious as if Oda will have a unique explanation for what these rocks are and why they exist. It could also work really well with what we speculated prior about the tree being similar to Impel Down. Other levels of the tree perhaps being hotter. But then from here we flip back to the Strats traveling with Dory and Brogy, and we get an incredibly cute scene where Robin decides that she wants to cut her hair to resemble her childhood so that if she were to meet Jaguar D. Saul, who she expects to be here, he'll recognize her. Honestly, I'm like borderline emotional trying to talk about this because just the way that Oda drew it, seeing the look on her face, she's like really excited. Yeah, I'm getting emotional talking about it. Don't blame me, blame Oda. You can also blame Oda further because at the very end of the chapter, we pivot to some new giants. And they say, this is bad. It's Mr. Saul. He's fallen and he can't get back up. Look, I don't think that Oda is going to take away this moment between Robin and Saul. There's just no universe in which that is a good decision. But even toying with the idea for a second, don't piss me off. I guess I'm hoping that this is a joke. Even the way that they said it, Saul fell down and he can't get back up. I have no idea if Japan is aware of this. Perhaps this is a relic of the TCB translation specifically, but this is literally an American Life Alert commercial. Life Alert is like a thing that you buy for your grandma so that if she falls down, she can talk to somebody. Honestly, it's kind of low-key hilarious because those commercials are memeable. But they did say that this is bad, and at the very least, I think that you have to assume that Saul's health is not great. It seems likely that he sustained real damage from Awakichi. Probability of death has skyrocketed, and I think Oda would probably do it. But I suppose we will see. Overall, I thought this was an incredibly fun setup-y chapter of One Piece, and Elbaf remains as exciting as ever. But yeah, guys, I think that's everything that I had to say about the chapter. I'm sorry that this review was delayed. I literally recorded the review, and I just didn't like it. I didn't like how it came out. I felt like I explained things poorly. It was just not interesting. So I scrapped the whole review and re-recorded it, so this is not really a first reaction. This is like a third reaction. But I hope that it was worth the wait nonetheless. But yeah, as always, I'm curious as to what you guys think. Whether you noticed something from the chapter that I might have missed, just share your thoughts. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful